This week, we are remembering the incredible life of Bishop John Shelby Spong. We at Holy Cross are particularly grateful for this life well lived. Thank you, Jack, especially for your many kindnesses to our community. We hold in our hearts Jack's beloved Christine, who was a life partner in every sense of the word. May the one who is holy embrace her in love. In May of 2011, Jack made one of his 3 visits to Holy Cross. It was a fabulous weekend, much learning, much generosity, and much kindness. We are indebted to Jack for all that he has taught us. What follows is an amateurish video recording of Jack's splendid sermon on the Sunday morning of his visit with us. Jack, thank you for a life well lived. You did indeed live fully, love wastefully, and you were all that you could be. Thanks be to all that is holy for the life and witness of Jack Spong.
Inviting us back. This is a really phenomenal congregation. I hope you all recognize it. If I lived within 100 kilometers of this church, I'd become a Lutheran. Maybe you ought not to tell the local Anglican bishop about that. But it is an incredible experience for us to come and feel the life of this congregation. And Dawn is a national treasure. Treat her well. Appreciate her gifts. You don't have many like that in the Christian community. So thank you for letting us share some time with you. Beginning a week from Thursday, in the weekly column that I write on the web, I will start a series on the examination of the resurrection narratives of the New Testament. The series will run for 6 to 10 weeks. I like to cram all of that series into this morning's 20-minute sermon. First of all, let me say, if you want to read the stories of the resurrection, and maybe that'd be a good thing to do once in a while, it's a very small amount of the New Testament. There are only 6 primary chapters in the New Testament that describe the events of the first Easter. The earliest one is 1 Corinthians 15, written by Paul in the mid-50s. Scanty details of the first story. The first narrative is in Mark, the 16th chapter, the first 8 verses. There's some other verses that have been added to Mark, but Mark didn't write them. They're 2nd century creations that got tacked on. Only 8 verses. Mark wrote that somewhere between 70 and 72. In Matthew, there's only one chapter, chapter 28. Matthew wrote that in the early 80s. In Luke, there's only one chapter, it's chapter 24. And Luke wrote that in the late 80s, maybe even in the early 90s. And in John, there is chapter 20, which appears to end John's Gospel. And that's the passage where you meet Thomas for the first time. But strangely enough, there is an epilogue that has been added to John, probably not by the author of John. It's chapter 21. It's quite different. And we think it's written by someone in the Johannine school, but not by the author of the first 20 chapters. But it purports to be another early, perhaps even primitive narrative of the resurrection. That's all there is. You could read all of those in less than 30 minutes, even if you're a slow reader like I am. It's not a massive amount of material. Most people never read them together. Most people never hear them together. Because when you go to church on Easter or in the Sundays following Easter, you tend to hear just a little piece of this corpus, and you never put it into context. And it might surprise you to know that the details are quite contradictory. That is, there's almost no detail in the resurrection narrative that isn't contradicted in another resurrection narrative in the Bible. They don't agree on such things as whether the women went to the tomb at dawn on the first day of the week. They don't agree on whether the women saw the raised Christ on the first day of the week. Mark says no, Matthew says yes, Luke says no, John says yes. You can't put that together. Even Jerry Falwell in America couldn't put that together. They don't agree on who was the first to see or to have resurrection dawn within them. They don't agree on where the disciples were when whatever the resurrection experience was broke into their consciousness. Paul and Mark and Matthew seem to say it was in Galilee. Luke and John say no, it was in Jerusalem. The appendix to John says no, it really was in Galilee. There's a lot of contradiction in detail. There's no contradiction in the reality. Indeed, there would be no New Testament had there not been some reality to Easter. So what I'd like to be doing in these columns is to go through all of those 6 pieces of the biblical narrative and analyze them carefully and ask them 4 questions, 4 basic questions. Who stands in the center of the resurrection experience? Where were they standing when whatever that was broke into their conscious minds? When did it happen? And how? What was the context? How did it appear? And when you analyze these resurrection narratives asking those questions, what I have discovered is that it has opened to me a whole different, far more profound way of reading the entire gospel story. I haven't got time to develop all of those questions with you, so we'll file 3 of them by title with just brief comments and then try to develop 1. When you ask the question, who stands in the middle of the resurrection experience? The weight of evidence in the New Testament, not unanimous, but the weight of evidence is that somehow Peter is crucial to that. And part of the reason for that is that Luke has Jesus say to Peter, Peter, when you are converted, strengthen your brethren. It looks like Peter is anticipated to be the one in whom the story is revealed. And of course, all of these Gospels are written after the fact. And you need to understand that they're not biographies. They're written in the light of whatever the experience was, looking back through Easter at the life of Jesus. But if you come to the conclusion, as I did in my study, that Peter is ultimately the central character in the drama of the resurrection, then you say, well, since everything in the Bible, in the Gospels, was written after the resurrection, let's look back at the non-resurrection stories and see if we can see some insight into Peter as the one who does this. And then the Gospels open up. That's why Peter's always listed first. In every list of the disciples, Peter is first. That's why Peter is always the one to speak. Every time Jesus asks the question, Peter speaks. We used to say he suffers from hoof-and-mouth disease. Lots of times he opens his mouth and puts his foot right in it. But there are lots of stories. There's Caesarea Philippi where Peter is the first to confess that Jesus is the Christ. There's a story in John's Gospel, chapter 6, when Jesus has gone through the feeding of the multitude and begins to talk about what it means to eat his flesh and drink his blood, that the people are so repelled that they begin to walk away, including the disciples. And Jesus turns to Peter and says, Peter, are you going to walk away also? And Peter says, Lord, to whom shall we go? You alone have the words of life. Peter looks like the central figure in the Christian drama. And that's why he's always placed number 1. When you ask the question where, you find the biblical story has tension between 2 competing centers. Did resurrection occur in Galilee? Whatever resurrection was, did it occur in Galilee? Did it occur in Jerusalem? The witnesses split. I can't think of any reason why, if it originally happened in Jerusalem, anybody would want to transfer it back to Galilee. Galilee had no status. Jerusalem was the status place to live. It was the richer suburbs of the Jewish world. They looked down on Galilee. They were all country bumpkins. Nothing good can come out of Nazareth. Messiah can't come out of Galilee. There's a lot of negativity toward the rural part of the Jewish world. Lots of status in the big city. So the first thing you weigh is, if it happened in Jerusalem, why do three of them suggest it was Galilee? I can think of no reason why you want to move it toward the rural part. Even the birth of Jesus is moved out of Nazareth down toward Bethlehem, which is part of the Jerusalem world. There was a lot of pressure to draw things in that direction. No pressure to draw it in the other direction. Instead, we have about half of these stories are set in Galilee. The next thing you do is you analyze those stories. And when you analyze the stories, you find that the Galilee tradition is far more primitive, far more mysterious, far less defined. You don't have apparitions. You don't have Jesus speaking in any of the Galilean appearances. That's only in Jerusalem. In the Jerusalem stories, you seem to have developed traditions. Jesus' resurrected body has become a resuscitated body, very physical. Handled and touched in Luke, handled and touched in John. None of that is in the Galilean appearances. So as you analyze the stories, you don't usually take something that's quite primitive and mysterious and literalize it. You don't do it in the other direction. You don't take something that's literally presented and then make it mysterious and non-literal. So all of the evidence begins to point toward Galilee. Galilee looks like the place where the disciples were when whatever it was that resurrection meant overwhelmed them, broke into their consciousness, transformed them. Let me skip to the fourth one and then go back to the third. What was the context? This is a little harder to find. There's not much evidence in Paul about a context, because Paul never gives a detail. There's not much evidence in Mark, the first gospel, because Mark never describes the resurrection experience to anybody. There's not even much context in Matthew, where the only time Matthew describes the resurrected Jesus appearing to the disciples is in Galilee on top of a mountain. And the disciples had trudged up the mountain, but Jesus seems to have come out of the sky, transformed. It's only when you get to Luke that you begin to get a hint of a context. In the gospel that was read in this church last Sunday, the Emmaus Road story is the first time you get a context. That story portrays a man named Cleopas and his traveling companion, who is unnamed, going from Jerusalem to Emmaus, a village about 6 miles away, after the events of Good Friday, and feeling traumatized. All the hopes they had in Jesus were dissipated. They had no image that you could be Messiah and be suffering and be killed. That violated all the images of Messiah that they were familiar with. And so they're in despair. Their hopes are gone. And according to this narrative, a stranger appears. They don't recognize him. He appears out of thin air. And he asks them what they're talking about, and they describe what they're saying. We had so many hopes, and now our hopes are gone. And the stranger begins to open to them the Hebrew Scriptures, and to find images in the Hebrew Scriptures where suffering and death do not preclude being Messiah. They just discuss these. Then they get to their village of Emmaus, and they invite the stranger to come in. By this time, they've talked enough so they feel really comfortable with each other. And the stranger goes in, and they invite him to the evening meal. And then in a really strange twist on the story, the stranger who is the guest suddenly presides over the meal. And he says the ceremonial blessing. And when he says the ceremonial blessing, he takes the bread and he blesses it. He gives thanks for it. And then he breaks it And then he gives it to them to eat. And it is in the breaking of the bread that they recognize who the stranger is. And he vanishes. Is the context in which they finally understood the meaning of Jesus when they reenacted their Eucharistic meal and finally saw him as a body that had been broken, as blood that had been shed, and he was still the source of life to them? Is that the context? Well, let's hold that for just a minute and look at the rest of the tradition. When Jesus finally appears in Luke in Jerusalem, the first thing he says is, "Do you have anything to eat?" That his food and the resurrection seem to be connected. They give him a piece of dried fish. When you get to John, the resurrection is portrayed as occurring in the evening of Easter Day. And it's at the time of the evening meal. It's in the context of eating that they experience Jesus' presence. And on this occasion, you might recall, Thomas was not present. And so the thing is repeated 1 week later, at the time of the evening meal on the second Sunday of the resurrection season. This time Thomas is present. There seems to be a connection between food and seeing the risen Christ. And that's particularly made clear in the fourth Gospel's Epilogue. The fourth Gospel's Epilogue seems to repeat all of the primary symbols. Peter stands at the heart of the 21st chapter. It's in Galilee. It's by the Sea of Galilee. And it involves the Eucharist, in which the Eucharistic verbs are used. He takes, he blesses, he breaks, he gives. Except John omits the middle two, because he's already identified Jesus as the bread of life, which ought to give us a hint about how the resurrection dawned. And it was when the bread of life was placed upon the cross that the body was broken and blessed. So in the Eucharist by the Sea of Galilee, Jesus, presiding over the Eucharist, takes and gives. He's already blessed and broken. And then you look back at every fleeting story in the New Testament. And in every one of them you find the familiar words. He took, he blessed, he broke, he gave. It's in the feeding of the 5,000. It's in the Last Supper. And then you look at the parables that Jesus uses, where it's around a banquet, and where the kingdom of God at the end of the world is described as sitting down at the table with Abraham, people from the north and south and east and west, and in the breaking of bread, the power of resurrection is experienced. So the context looks like it's related to the Eucharistic celebration. So Peter is at the center. Galilee appears to be primary. Some sort of liturgical Eucharistic celebration appears to be the context. What about the time? Let me spend just a minute on the time. The familiar symbol is 3 days. And that symbol comes into the tradition early in 1 Corinthians. And Paul gives us the first description of Easter. He says, quote, "He was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures." Doesn't tell you what Scriptures. But the raising was identified with the third day. So does that mean 72 hours? Is it 3 literal days? Is that what Paul is saying? Is that a symbol or is that a time measure? Well, let's look at it. When you come to the first Gospel we read, and you get to Mark, and the symbol has shifted, become rather wobbly. 3 times in Mark's Gospel, Jesus is said to have predicted the events of the end of his life. He talks about how he will be suffering, how he will die. And then Jesus says, "And on the third day I will be raised." No, he doesn't. I beg your pardon. He says, after 3 days I will be raised. Well, that's different. Paul says it's on the third day. Jesus says it's after 3 days. Can you count? On the third day, if the crucifixion's on Friday, you come to Sunday. If it's after 3 days, you're already at Monday. Matthew and Luke both had Mark in front of them when they wrote. Both Matthew and Luke write an expanded version of Mark. So when Matthew comes to these 3 occasions where Jesus says, after 3 days I will be raised, Matthew changes every one of them. So in Matthew they say, on the third day. Luke comes to those 3 references in Mark, and he changes 2 of them and omits the third one. So Matthew and Luke both line up with Paul on the third day. And after 3 days, sort of disappears. But it's there in the background and it causes a little wobble. Then we look at the time according to the Gospels. Look at it literally. It wasn't 3 days at all. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all say Jesus was buried about sundown on Friday and raised at dawn on Sunday. And you add 6 o'clock on Friday to midnight is 6 hours. From midnight Saturday to midnight Sunday is 24 hours. Put those together, you get 30 hours. From midnight Sunday to dawn is 6 hours. You get 36 hours. That's a day and a half. It's not 3 days at all. It's kind of wobbly symbol. Maybe it wasn't meant to be literalized. Maybe it's a symbol, not a time measure. Then you do a few other things that gives you a little more questions, I suppose. You look at the first gospel, where Jesus appears to no one. The women come to the tomb in the first gospel. They find the tomb empty. They find a messenger who's not an angel. He's a messenger. And he's simply described as a young man in a white robe. It's not an angel. He doesn't become an angel until Matthew upgrades him 10 years later. You know, people wear white robes and people don't mistake them for angels. But in the tradition, this angel grows. It's a young man in a white robe in Mark. It's an angelic being that comes out of the sky in Matthew. It becomes 2 angelic beings by the time you get to Luke. The symbol is a little wobbly. And all this messenger says is, he is not here. He has been raised. He will go before you into Galilee. You will see him in your home district. Well, do you know how far it is from Jerusalem to Galilee? It's a minimum of a 7 to 10 day journey. So what does 3 days mean when you're not going to see him until 7 to 10 days later? The time looks like it stretches a bit. Then you go to Matthew. Matthew describes the risen Christ appearing to the disciples only once, on a mountain. And Jesus is already transformed, comes out of the sky, even though the story of the ascension won't be written for another 10 years. It looks like in the early tradition, resurrection and ascension were 2 parts of the same thing. He was raised from the dead into the life of God, not from the dead back into the life of this world. That doesn't develop until you get to Luke. And Luke is 9th to 10th decade. But even if you take this story seriously and literally, the disciples are now in Galilee, and that appearance could not have come earlier than 7 to 10 days later. It's outside the 3-day boundary. And then you come to Luke. And Luke says that he rose from the dead in a very physical way on the first day of the week. And then he says, but he appeared over a period of 40 days. And the appearances ended when he ascended into the sky. First time the ascension story has been written. So now we have a period of 40 days. And then you come to John. John says that Jesus rose from the dead on the morning of Easter, and and immediately ascended into heaven with only Mary Magdalene being in that interval. And then when he appeared to the disciples that evening, he had already ascended. So he could walk through walls. And he breathed on them. And they received the Holy Spirit. Pentecost, Easter, and Ascension are all within one day in John's Gospel. But then you have this enigmatic, well, he does appear again a week later with Thomas present. And then you have this enigmatic chapter 21. An epilogue, written a little bit later. The opening verse of chapter 21 has Peter say, "Folks, I'm going fishing." Now, he's not a sport fisherman. He's not going off on a weekend with his friends to do some fishing. He's going back to work. That's his job. He was a fisherman. That verse says that Peter has sort of worked through the trauma of Jesus' death, and now he's gotten to the place where he's got to put his life back into some order. Psychologically, we could study that with human beings and tell people about what kind of time frame it takes to go from the trauma of grief back into reordering your life. But it's not 3 days. Those of you who have been through a traumatic grief experience know that. So it could be weeks, it could be months. Peter says, "I'm going to go fishing." And the others say, "Well, we'll go back with you." And so they're in Galilee. It took them at least 7 to 10 days to get there, and then whatever weeks were going on. So some time has passed. And finally in Galilee, by the sea, involving a Eucharistic meal, involving the restoration of Peter, the story of resurrection is told in a very fresh and original way. Maybe an epilogue, but it may reflect a far earlier tradition. In the event, all of the symbols that we search the New Testament to discover are present in this 21st chapter. Peter is in the center of the drama. They are in Galilee. It's in the context of a Eucharistic meal. And a significant amount of time has passed between crucifixion and Easter. So maybe we need to break open the literal quality of 3 days. Maybe the 3 days between crucifixion and Easter was created for our liturgical use. Because if you observe the crucifixion on Friday, you want to observe the resurrection on Sunday. But maybe what they've done is to telescope the time where they had to search the scriptures, where they come to a whole new understanding of what Messiah means now that Messiah is one who suffers and dies. They've got to find new images to understand Jesus. They've got to get through the trauma of their grief and reorient their lives. And that takes days, that takes weeks, that might take months. And only then do their eyes open. And they begin to see beyond the limits of their humanity. As that hymn said a few minutes ago, beyond the boundaries of our language. And Jesus is raised. And so are they. And their lives are transformed. And those who had abandoned Jesus when he was arrested are now so deeply committed to him and to this vision of his living presence that they will never again abandon that reality. They will die first. And the tradition is that they all did. Even John dies in prison. He's the only one that doesn't seem to die violently. But this life of Jesus has transformed their lives. They were cowards who fled in fear. They now become heroes who die for the reality of their vision. They were Jews who could not imagine anything other than God being God. And yet something drives them to the place that they can no longer look at Jesus without seeing the presence of God in him. They could no longer look at God without seeing Jesus as part of who God is. Well, they didn't draw creeds. They didn't get doctrines of incarnation and Trinity. That would come in the 3rd and 4th century. But they were trying to find a way to deal with the reality of their experience that God was so powerfully present in this Christ. And that they had perceived God's presence, and God's presence was not bound by finitude and by death. That's what happens in the resurrection experience. And you and I can't write about that. We can't talk about that. We can only point to that. Because whatever the resurrection was an action in the life of God beyond time and space, and we don't have any language that will go there. So we just point, and we have symbols. And the symbols are very clear. And one of the symbols says that it is in the Eucharist that we understand the crucifixion. But it took us a long time before we got to that moment. So if you want to study the resurrection, and I recommend that we all do, it's the basic part of our Christian faith, you need to study it all together. You need to study it symbolically and not literally. There are a lot of people that think literally true, it can't be true. That's nonsense. We use non-literal language all the time. I could say to you, Tom Dougherty is a big-hearted man. You wouldn't take that literally. If you took it literally, you'd call the ambulance. He has an enlarged heart. But we understand that. And when we say, receive the life of God in the life of Jesus, and the life of God can never be bounded by human finitude and human mortality, then how do you find the language to describe that? That's the human problem. That doesn't mean the reality is less. It means the human ability to describe the things of God is quite finite. The tragedy is that religious people, recognizing the limitations of their language, or maybe not recognizing it, begins to put the God experience into our own words. And then we literalize our words. And then we say, if you don't believe it the way we have described it, you're not a Christian. That's baloney. There's no way we can take the experience of God and capture it in the words of human beings. You can't do it in the scriptures. You can't do it in the creeds. You can't do it in the doctrines. You can't do it in the dogmas. And any religious movement that literalizes its own explanations finally winds up persecuting anybody who disagrees with them, or burning them at the stake, or becoming religious bigots, or going to religious wars, because by God we're going to make you believe what we believe, or there's something wrong with you. And we fear that if you don't, there must be something wrong with me. And you can't stand that. So the tendency in all religious language, in all religious systems, is to literalize your own expressions of your faith, instead of recognizing that the best we can see, according to Paul, is through a glass darkly. The resurrection is not something you can finally describe. It's something you have to live. And the resurrection of Jesus doesn't mean just something that happened to Jesus. It also happened to Peter. It also happened to the apostles. And it's going to be real for you and me. It's got to happen to you and me. If you are raised with Christ, says St. Paul, you must seek those things which are above, where Christ sits at the right hand of God. Paul wrote that 40 years before the ascension story came into the Christian tradition. He's not talking literally. He's talking symbolically. You later literalize. If you literalize Easter, you will lose it. If you literalize your definition of God, God will become an idol. If you literalize your scriptures and say this is the absolute Word of God, you finally will destroy the essence of the Christian faith. If you literalize your creeds, your doctrines, your dogmas, if you say my church is the only true church, my religion is the only true religion, you have imposed human limits upon the grace and love of God. Resurrection is so much more than that. As I analyzed the resurrection narratives, I actually came to the conclusion that the Epilogue of John, chapter 21, may well be the most primitive of all the resurrection stories. For Peter stands at the center. They are in Galilee. The Eucharist is the context, and a significant period of time after the crucifixion has transpired. And then the resurrection story can break into incredible new meanings. Well, it'll take me 10 weeks to do that in my column. You got a quick preview.